Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Scott Beaulier, the Ronald and Kay Olson Dean of Business. Thanks for tuning in to another major guest lecture that we have here at North Dakota State University this afternoon. It's February 23rd. We are recording this, so people have some sense of when it took place. It's snowing outside today, but a lovely day to talk about free speech on campuses. This program is made possible by the Menard family. This is the Menard speaker series within the Challey Institute here in NDSU's College of Business. Philanthropy makes events like this, which are open to the community, to students, and to other professors. In fact, anyone worldwide has access to this. It's only made possible through philanthropy, and we thank our partner organization, the NDSU Foundation, for promoting this, and welcome anyone who is at their activities earlier this afternoon. If you're interested at all in our $400 million capital campaign, which is closing in, and any day we'll cross that $400 million mark, go to nddsu.com to learn more. Today is a really special one, which is why, in part, I'm hosting and handling the conversation today. John Bitson, our director, has done a fabulous job with guests like Arthur Brooks and J.D. Vance, but today we're hosting Emily Chamlee-Wright, who is a friend. I have the honor of sitting on the Institute for Humane Studies board and get to work with Emily in that capacity. And Emily, thank you so much for joining us. Your bio here is something I'm just going to run through real quickly, and then we're going to get to a little bit about IHS and talk about what's going on campuses across America in our hour or so. Because this is a conversation about free speech, we're going to regulate the Q&A a little differently today too. So we ask our audience members, looks like there's several hundred of them right now, please go ahead and ask questions in the Zoom Q&A down at the bottom of your screens. If you like someone else's question, you can help us by aggregating or putting a thumbs up on that. And the higher the thumbs up, the more likely that question is to be asked in the Q&A about 45 minutes from now. So please embrace wisdom of crowds or democracy. Keep it appropriate, but go ahead and chime in with questions throughout the talk. So with no further ado, it's a real pleasure to introduce Emily Chamlee-Wright, president of the Institute for Humane Studies, or IHS, which we're going to talk more about in just a couple of minutes. Prior to joining IHS, Emily was the provost at Washington College and was a professor of economics at Beaulier College before that, so she knows a thing or two about snow as well. Emily studied economics at George Mason University. Her research explores topics ranging from post-disaster recovery to economic development to liberal education. And as we'll discuss today, more of her work recently is in the area of thought leadership around ethical and cultural requirements of civil discourse in the academy and broader civil society. So boy, do we need more people working on that topic. And Emily, thanks so much for being here today.
Scott, it's my pleasure to be here, especially with you. It's great to see you as always.
You too. So let's go ahead and dive right in. What is IHS? I know we're celebrating 60 years, and I've been with IHS, I think, 20 some odd years.
Yeah, for like 59 of those years or something right. Like that, right?
Right. Not quite 59, but close.
Okay.
What is the organization? What are you doing now?
So the Institute for Humane Studies supports and partners with scholars who are interested in ideas about a free society. So we generally come out of the classical liberal intellectual tradition, but we work with scholars across the ideological spectrum because across the ideological spectrum are scholars who are interested in these ideas. And so that's what we do, is we work with professors who ask the big questions about what are the underlying principles and what are the institutions that drive the good society.
So I've noticed you've been doing promotion of books and book projects, helping people on sabbaticals, helping fund and support travel to conferences, and so it's open to any. I mean, this is a huge plug to any faculty listening, right? It's open to any.
Indeed, and graduate students. So okay. Graduate students and faculty who are interested in these questions, these ideas. And we support scholars really from the first moment that they say, I'm really interested in the world of ideas and want a life of the mind in the academy. And we work with folks through the graduate student years, but also into and across the trajectory of their scholarly careers, because you need different things if you're a scholar at different stages of your career. And that ecosystem, that community of scholars, is also put in service to other scholars, because that's the most important thing that we do besides the underwriting research, is that we convene scholars so that they can connect, infuse new ideas into their research programs, give one another feedback on their ideas, on their manuscripts. That sense of connectivity is probably the most important thing that we do, is to connect scholars to the ideas and connect scholars to one another.
So IHS is also involved in free speech initiatives and trying to help maintain civil discourse on campuses, and also just inject really thoughtful argument and discussion into debates that maybe have either become too narrow and not really open to alternative points of view, but then also helping just make sure people understand what the rules of the game are in scholarly discourse. And we're going to get into that, some of the foundations of scholarly discourse in a little bit. But can you talk about how your institute is helping drive better conversations?
Sure. So again, everything we do is with scholars. So, we only go into a campus environment if a scholar, if a professor invites us to join them. So that inviting to join them can be in the form of underwriting their research, for leading edge, cutting edge projects, scholarly work on free speech, whether in the academy or in the broader world. Also, we do work with professors who want to bring the ideas to their students. So if you wanted to do a discussion colloquium with your own students on your campus, whether it's on free speech or other ideas that are essential to a free society, we will also help you to host that gathering. And it's usually a weekend event where people can just totally nerd out on ideas and dive into classical texts that push their thinking in new ways. And it's just like a holiday for geeks. So that's pretty much how we support scholars on the free speech angle, is by bringing in really smart people to campus that professors want to bring in, hosting those colloquia, and also underwriting their research too.
So before becoming a president of a major organization, you were one of the geeks. You miss the academic life at all? And can you talk at all about how that helps you in now giving back to higher ed in general? What is it like?
It's been an evolution, it's been an evolution, because when I was a professor at Beaulier College, I was there for almost 20 years. And I think about that experience as being like my second alma mater, because I learned so much about what it means to be in an intellectual community that it was like a second graduate degree in many respects. And I came into that environment wanting to be this champion, this, hopefully articulate champion of economic ideas and the economic way of thinking, because my sense was that if I could just impart that economic way of thinking to my students, that would make them, some of them would go on to become professors themselves, which is awesome when that happens. But just even if they took only one econ course, if they just could understand public policy through the lens of the economic way of thinking, that would make them better citizens, better parents, better people. That was my mission, was to impart that sort of economic way of thinking to my students. And along the way, I started to really fall in love with the mission of liberal arts colleges and liberal learning and liberal education. No matter how big or small the place was, I was starting to really understand that ability to interrogate one's own assumptions, interrogate one's own knowledge, was a critical piece of what it meant to become a liberally educated person. And I saw us collectively at the college doing that work. And I thought, higher education needs better champions for what the true meaning of a university is. And so I started to dip my toe in the water of academic leadership. And Scott, as you well know, once you dip your toe into the waters of academic leadership, someone is going to grab your ankle and pull you into the deep end really fast. And so that's what happened to me. And I became provost of a small liberal arts college on the East Coast at Washington College on Maryland's Eastern Shore. And what was so exciting about that work is that I got to work with extraordinary faculty who cared deeply about their students and wanted to bring their ideas. It wasn't always from economics, it was from other disciplines. And I learned that there was that kind of passion across the disciplines. And I learned a little bit about these other disciplines and learned what it took to be a champion for great scholars, great teachers, no matter what stripe or flavor they came in, whether they were economists or musicologists or physicists. And it started me thinking that I really loved the academy as a whole, and I wanted to be a champion for great professors across the country. And that's when I started in on conversations with the Institute for Humane Studies and their leadership and their board, and that's what led me here. So it's fantastic. I get to be like a dean for scholars across the country, and I only work with scholars who want to work with me. So that's like the best dean's job in the world.
I have a lot of people who want to work with me, so it's still pretty fabulous here. So let's transition to you're not that far removed from higher ed, and you're observing it and you're interacting it with every day, and get to the topic here of free speech. And what are you seeing? You've seen the best and the worst of higher ed in your time, both within the industry and now in your current role. And is there any commentary you can provide on where we are on this pendulum today? Like, is it really, really bad? Or is it just always, cases like the Middlebury shouting down of Charles Murray and, canceling of, various speakers? Is this just something that's more amplified because we're more plugged into everything right now? Or is your experience that, this is in fact something very different and kind of scary?
Before we dive into that, because I think that's a nuance, there's a lot of nuance there to answer. And the way you've set up the question, I think is already appreciates that nuance. But let me pull the lens back a little bit to ask the question, why do we care? Like, why do we care that higher education gets this thing right and gets the sort of commitment to open inquiry, that commitment to intellectual openness and academic freedom right? Why do we care about that? If all we're thinking about is, well, what is the confined 4-year experience of people who are typically in that college age range? I think that's important. That's very important. But I mean, we're really missing the bigger picture if that's all we're focused in on. Why we care about this is because higher education really is a kind of foundational institution of a free society. That it's in higher education that we can display those basic underlying principles of what it looks like to live in a liberal democratic society, that we solve our disagreements by speaking to each other, by talking to each other. We govern ourselves not through force, but by holding each other to account with, to expectations and standards of integrity and honesty and openness and a willingness to listen, as well as a commitment to contributing to the exercise of discovery and intellectual progress. That's what I would describe as the Republic of Science, right? This is a phrase that was used by Michael Polanyi to describe how a system of intellectual progress unfolds. It's that system of norms and practices that kind of emerges from the bottom up, where scholars are engaging with one another in this way, course correcting one another, feeding off of one another, building off of each other's programs, challenging where appropriate. And in that process, we get intellectual progress that leads to human progress. What an extraordinary institution to offer a free society. So whenever I start asking questions about freedom of speech on campus, I always try to remind myself to go back to that. Because if we don't understand why we care about this at that level, then we probably are going to get we're going to get it wrong in some way. So let me start there, but I want to pause and see if that kind of triggers a response from you about what you're seeing too, because you're in this place that a vantage point that you're seeing a lot of good stuff happening, as well as stuff that's really challenging. So I want to stop there and have you talk a little bit.
It's interesting. On a day-to-day basis, it seems like 99% of all interactions are exactly what you described. There still is a republic of science that is deeply pursued. If you look at like the closing of the American mind too, there's a point of view in, Bloom's book that this is especially still the case in the hard sciences. So we're a land grant here at NDSU, and the scientists in engineering and ag, they just put their heads down and they keep working on that next scientific question they're really chasing after. So they're not as wrapped up in some of these, just these hot issues that we're seeing blow up on different campuses around the country. I'm also biased because North Dakota is just really just a wonderful place for, students come here, they want to learn. It's still, like myself, a Midwestern place where, they're just appreciating their chance in academic life. So I don't feel like it's, I guess I asked you the question, is it a lot worse right now? And it doesn't feel like it based on experience here. But then you open up your Twitter feed and you just doom scroll, and it's, it's one case after another of these campuses really hot. And we have legislation here in North Dakota right now where legislators are really worried about the state of the industry. And I figured I'd ask you if your sense at 35,000 feet is more pessimistic than.
Yeah, there's good reason to be concerned. If we look, for instance, at the recent fire report, and you might think that the pandemic might have led to fewer of these cases of censorious behavior on the part of administrations and student groups and professors themselves, but because we're not physically all, in the colleges or universities public square. But in fact, the online education has been a facilitator of more censorious, and also the pandemic controversies themselves have been a source of some of the debate that has been shut down. So, according to that fire report, I think we do need to be, based on that, we do need to be alert to increasing concerns. And also at the same time, I can hold that thought in my head and also believe you when you say that most of the time it is the Republic of Science. Most of the time, the faculty and students are having these engaged conversations around difficult stuff and really making progress in the way we would want them to make progress. Both of these things can be true simultaneously. We make a mistake, though, if we conclude from the first that there's no value in higher education, right? That it's all gone to hell in a handbasket, and it's not worth supporting, colleges and universities. I think that's a mistake. And I also think we make a mistake if we say, hey, nothing to see here. There's no concern. It's all fine. I think that that's also a concern because it means that we're not paying attention to the concerns about the quality of that system of idea exchange and discovery, because that is in peril if we do not attend to the basic principles of academic freedom and intellectual freedom. And if that's in peril, then I think the broader society is in peril as well. And I'll stop there because I think that gets to the point that both of these things can be true. And we also need to continue to keep our eye on the ball and attend to the real underlying concerns of the academy, which is tending to those academic values.
Let's get to a 2019 piece because you do see some really concerning trends that you talk about in that piece, and it's titled "The Need to Presume Good Faith in Campus Conversation." So while I have just said, it doesn't seem that bad here at NDSU, and 99% of conversations are good, the ones that make the headlines, like all news, are the really, really bad ones. And you talk in that piece a little bit about the suspension of openness and people not even being willing to come to the table with curiosity, a desire to learn, and they've made up their minds before ever entering dialogue. So we're getting to the foundational issues here that you raise of this is an ambitious project to allow discovery to come about in the academy through challenging ideas, allowing for open inquiry, and you being uncomfortable, but at minimum being curious and open-minded to someone else's point of view. What is your advice for people who really, like, I want to walk that walk and be really open-minded and, engage someone who I fundamentally disagree with, but it's hard. It's like a really heavy lift because, like, we're economists. There are certain things that we think are like the laws of economics, and you want to just say, no, that's really not true, and I'm going to go back to my office now, as opposed to try to understand another person's point of view. So what is the like the recipe for just maintaining and advancing dialogue with someone who's just not even in the same mental model as you?
Yeah, I think that's the language of recipe is valuable because, and like any recipe, you can riff off of a recipe in several different ways. But one variation of the recipe is when you encounter someone who just comes at an issue just from a completely different perspective, and it seems like there's not even a common language. Even though you're both speaking the same vernacular, you're not really speaking the same language from a disciplinary perspective. And so the shift I try to make in my own mind in those moments is to ask myself the question, okay, Scott is here. I know that Scott is a thoughtful, intelligent human being, and yet he's looking at the same world I'm looking at and coming away with wildly different conclusions than I came at. Why? How can that possibly be? And not how can that be? He's so narrow-minded. How can that possibly be? But a genuine, open version of the question that says, how is it possible that Scott and I are looking at the same world and he's coming away with radically different conclusions? I want to understand that better. And so the exercise is not one in which, especially if it's sort of an underlying long-held belief, I doubt that you're going to persuade me suddenly that prices suddenly don't work, right? Or that demand curves slope upward. You're not going to persuade me of that. But still, there's something that you may be seeing in the world that is informing your perspective that I don't understand. And so if all I do is come away from the conversation understanding better why this really smart person sees the world differently than I do, and understand that there's a kind of rhyme and reason behind that perspective, that's a win, right? I mean, so that's a win. And if you can then explain it back to them, that's even better, right? Because then that's going to be the thing that allows you to have the next conversation. And the goal of every conversation shouldn't be that I try to persuade you or to come over to my point of view. That may happen, especially, but it's not going to happen in one fell swoop. And if it does, and even if it doesn't ever happen, you now have come away from that relationship understanding more deeply why some people see the world just so starkly different. And if you're a scholar, that makes you a better teacher, right? So I may never persuade Scott, but if I understand how Scott's perspective is probably informing other people's perspective as well, that makes me a better teacher. And so really trying to understand the wisdom that people bring with them into any conversation is a place to begin. And it's a posture of humility that we should all be entering into our conversations with.
It makes sense, and I think we're seeing some really interesting collaborations happen in the real world where people who, they don't agree on anything are coming together and, breaking bread for the advancement of commonly shared causes. So they'll disagree on 95% of things, but then they'll find something that they can stand with each other on and keep going. I have a follow-up on that though, which is, just kind of continuing on this maintaining openness to people you disagree with is hard. Is there ever a limit where you simply say, you know what, I just can't engage this person, whether it's a racist or the crazy uncle at the Thanksgiving table? Is there a hard line where you just can say, I've tried, and this is, I need to cut my losses, so to speak, on trying to engage this particular group or this individual?
Yeah, and let me break it down into two versions of that. One is the well-meaning interlocutor, the well-meaning conversation partner, who, you know, we want to have standards in academic discourse, like we will hold one another to, if you and I are presenting a case for something, we're going to hold each other to the standards of evidence and standards of, you know, like verify your sources, that sort of thing. That is a perfectly reasonable standard and is part of the Republic of Science. I don't think that we need to necessarily lead with that principle at the Thanksgiving dinner table, right? And it doesn't mean that we leave it behind completely either, but we don't need to challenge, you know, in a frontal assault Aunt Ruth when she's passing the potatoes, when we think that her citations are off base, right? So we can modulate at the Thanksgiving dinner table. If it's and again, we can employ that language and thinking process of empathy when it's someone who just disagrees with us. We don't need to come out, you know, full barreled and demand that they, you know, demand of the conversation that people are persuaded. I think that we can demand of ourselves that we understand their perspective. So all that being said, you're then describing the next move, which we need to take if at the dinner table someone expresses incredibly morally obnoxious points of view. Are we ever then you know, is it appropriate to step away from that? I think the answer is, of course, it's appropriate to step away from that. I think before you step away, you might offer the feedback and say, I think that point of view is wrongheaded. I think it is immoral. And here's the case I would make. So if you're in a position where you can do that, you know, that you've done that before, you feel like you can lay it out and you feel like you're in a good position to do it, I say go for it, right? And where you need to kind of check yourself is to make sure that that first of all, you're taking care of yourself, right? You know, we don't want to demand of everybody that they always stand up to the person with the morally obnoxious point of view. If it's just like, this is not the right moment for me to do that. But this goes back to why teachers are so important, why good professors are so important, because they give us reps at articulating difficult to articulate messages and to work through an argument or a point of view in a way that is, I don't mean dispassionate in the way like I have no passion for it, but I mean just kind of stepping away from my own emotion of it. If I've got practice at that, I'm going to be better at that in the moment. And you have to forgive yourself if you just can't do it. You walk away, wait for another day, right? But if you can, it's a real service to the world that you can offer the feedback that says, here's why that view is morally reprehensible to me. I'll lay it out for you. And if you can do that in a calm way with a sort of calm confidence, that very well could change somebody's mind. If it doesn't change the crazy uncle's mind, at least the other people who are at the table are going, thank God, someone finally said that, right? And so think about all the different ways we're in that kind of environment where we might not persuade the person with the morally obnoxious point of view, but if we can articulate it in a calm, confident way, we give other people language to do the same who are listening in. So there's real power in being able to do that. But doing that is hard. So reps matter. It's like learning any other discipline. It's like learning a sport or, you know, a physical discipline. You've got to have practice at it. And that's why professors are so important, is that they give us practice at thinking through, talking through difficult moral murky territory.
Got to eat your vegetables, students, you know. So let's, before leaving, I want to transition to civil society a little bit. We're headed there a little bit with that discussion of Thanksgiving dinners. But before leaving higher ed, give us what, your organization is really concerned about the future of higher ed in some respects. Give us the worst case if we lose this presumption of good faith and campuses just become what many are worried about. And we see at some places an echo chamber of certain ideas, certain points of view, classrooms where the students can dictate what is making them feel comfortable or not. You see these stories of just how far it's gotten at some places. And is it just a lot more of that really worries you in terms of the outcome to fear, or are there other things that
and as bad as that is, as bad as that sounds, I think it's even bigger than that. I mean, think about the polarized society that we're living in right now. Think about, and by polarized, I don't mean the fact that we disagree with each other on a lot of stuff. That's not a problem, right? The pluralism in ideas is fine. What's wrong with living in a polarized society is that the extremes at both ends are generating, the illiberal extremes on one end are generating illiberal responses on the other, which fuels illiberalism on the other side too. That when I talk about the underlying ethos of a liberal democratic society, a free society, a society in which we are all one another's dignified equals, those principles are the liberal project that was embedded within the Declaration of Independence, right? That's our project, right? And of course, that project is incomplete, and that project is still a work in progress. But the principles that underlie it are the principles that are the animating spirit of colleges and universities. It's that commitment to openness, not only within the broader society, but intellectual openness. That's the driving ethos of the open academy, the open university, the idea of the open university. That is, in principle, a kind of microcosm for what the good society looks like. Think about the concept of a basic liberal concept like toleration, that you and I can have very, very different points of view, but we can still live next door to each other and not tear one another apart. That is that sort of animating spirit of a liberal society, of a liberal democratic society. Well, you need examples of seeing how that plays out in the world. And the university setting is the perfect place to demonstrate those values and those principles. If we lose those animating academic values of the open university, society as a whole has lost one of its best examples of how to live together peaceably, right? And so that's what I think is at stake, is if we don't get this right, we're going to get more illiberalism at both ends of the ideological spectrum. So to me, it's an existential crisis, not only to colleges and universities, not only to that industry, but to the broader society as a whole.
I was going to ask you later, you use this term now, though, liberal society and liberal social order. You're talking small L or capital L liberal there? It sounds like, I don't know, Locke, Smith, that kind of
right. And
characters.
Yeah, and it's a word that the word liberal can be confusing because it gets used in so many different ways. And I mean it much more in this Lockean sense of the word liberal, Adam Smith's sense of the word liberal. It's that constellation of the institutional rules of the game, the moral principles, and cultural commitments and value commitments to openness, right? To the sense that we can live together and not tear each other apart. And again, these principles did not come full flower all at once, right? Like the idea of toleration, religious toleration, came about because we were killing each other, right? And in the Reformation, we had to come up with something better if we weren't going to destroy each other, right? So religious intolerance, we saw where that led. It led to war and poverty and all of the atrocities that we associate with centuries of conflict. We came to that resolution of religious toleration was hard won through that experience. And so that's the kind of principle that we need to elevate, that we can expand it to being just beyond religious toleration. It also can be toleration for different points of view within the political space, in cultural spaces. And so that toleration is a hallmark of the good society, the liberal society, because it's a basic rule of the game that allows us to live with each other peacefully, even though we don't feel the need to compel one another to adopt our point of view on particular versions of what we believe the good life to be.
So you said a few minutes ago that the university is an example of what, having, I'm going to use your own words here, having the presumption of good faith in campus conversations can produce. And if that example goes astray, it's bad for the world. Is it actually even more severe than that civilization's at risk if we fail at the higher education and university model? Because eventually we don't have an educated citizenry in the same way that the university project was trying to establish for everyone.
Yeah. And that could be overstated or misunderstood in the following way. It's like saying only people with a university degree are, bringing good ideas into society, and that would be a mistake to make that point to articulate it that way. And that's not what I believe, and I don't think that that's what you believe. Mm-hmm. But there is power to the ideas that are cultivated within higher education. That we do bring ideas that we acquire in that 4 years of university training. We do bring them out to the world, but also the professoriate are at this for 30, 35 years over the arc of their career. So they, I think of public intellectual work as being like a form of teaching. So it's not just what the students themselves learn in their classes. It's also the enculturation of how to engage with people across differences. And that can be differences of where you come from. It can be also differences about what you believe and how you think. And then beyond that, though, is that sort of ripple effect of what happens in a university setting leaks out into the world. And ideas matter in terms of shaping public policy. They shape the broader culture. And it's oftentimes difficult to exactly, trace back where precisely an idea that's out there in the broader culture, how it traces back to the academy, and not all do, but many do. And so the ideas that we're cultivating in the university setting are important to the broader society as well, for sure.
So, a more recent piece, you're trying to extend the university prerequisites for good conversation to society more generally. And can you talk about the differences there between higher ed, which has some of the smartest people you'll ever encounter just in terms of raw gray matter, really creative, independent, you're not going to tell them what to do, and that community engaging in civil discourse versus a general public or a civil society more generally? And are there any differences in norms between trying to reach truth with my mother and reaching truth with other scholars?
Yeah, I think it's a both and. So again, trying to reach truth with our neighbor or with our family members, we always have to remind ourselves what role we're playing, right? And what's the goal of the conversation? And in any one conversation, it might be, going back to the earlier part of our conversation, it may be about, my job here is actually to try and understand how they came to this point of view, rather than to interrogate them, with a high caliber, intellect. That might not be the goal of that conversation. That being said, I do think that there are principles that we should hold ourselves to and hold people in civil society to. And one is accountability to your ideas. That if you're going to be advancing a strong point of view that's based on asserted evidence, that you ought to be willing to say, well, this is where I learned that from, and subject that to scrutiny, and be willing in a spirit of humility to subject it to scrutiny. So that's a basic piece. When we think about online social media discourse as well, we talked a little bit about feedback before. Feedback is always valuable, and we should receive feedback with a sense of humility. Those should be some basic rules of the game, is enter into conversations with a spirit of humility, like you've got something to learn from everybody, and also be willing to offer feedback too. And that can take some courage, but we should be willing to assert some courage. Now, that being said, giving feedback is entirely different than mobbing, right? Or social media mobbing of any kind. And think about the different structures that are in place there. That if I'm offering you feedback, or my Uncle Frank from the dinner table we talked about earlier, if I'm offering him feedback, my sincere hope is that Uncle Frank course corrects. Right? That's when you know it's really feedback, is you really hope that the person you're giving the feedback to improves in some way, right? Intellectually or morally or something, right? If you're engaging in mobbing behavior, what you really want is that person to screw up even further. You want to create a sort of heightened emotional environment where they lash out even more. And you can then point your finger and say, aha, right? I always knew that Uncle Frank was, that so-and-so. If that's your orientation, you need to check that right at the door and say, and be honest with yourself and say, am I really offering this feedback so that I hope that this person improves, course corrects in some way, or am I hoping to embarrass them or to gain a kind of mob reaction to them, and hopefully and even create a sort of environment where they lash out even more? If that's the outcome, you're not engaging in good conversation. You're not adhering to basic principles of what is required for us to engage in civil society in an open, honest way.
I have one more question, and then we'll see what's in the Q&A waiting for us here, Emily.
Looking forward to it.
I have a little more time too, if we can go on and talk about the economic and political order of today, and just how crazy the discourse has gotten in recent years there. But I'll pause and see what's in the Q&A. Before we get there, though, there's a number of examples, both within higher education, but within civil society, of people simply not wanting to hear anything that doesn't agree with their worldview. We're seeing it in retirement communities where, there's Florida retirement communities where nobody ever wants to set foot out of the community because they like their little bubble of people who have similar ideologies to them, similar, in many cases, race. It's just a very insular community. And I think you could draw parallels in some parts of higher education too. What does your approach, or your strategy here in terms of trying to expand openness and encourage better conversations offer for just the completely not isolated, they're significant, the completely insular,
siloed.
Yeah, the siloed people, the polarized, I guess, back to that issue.
Yeah. So I would go back to the sort of, athletic and sports analogy, that you and I have talked about this before, that great teaching is like great coaching. And some of our favorite teachers are also great coaches, and there's a symmetry there, and we talked a little bit before about how reps matter, and a good coach does runs has you run the same drills over and over again, in part because we understand that learning things is a discipline. In part because we have to recognize the moves that we're making have to become second nature to us. The analogy or the parallel to academic discourse, or just discourse generally, especially if it's discourse across differences, is very, very similar. And I don't mean it to be just kind of abstract comparisons. I actually think that there is a physiological challenge to engaging with people who disagree with you. You have to overcome that feeling like your heart's beating out of your chest. You have to, if there are power dynamics that you've got to overcome, if you've got to overcome your own sense of, uneasy confidence around a new topic area, you've got to calm those nerves, and you've got to learn how to breathe deep and through those moments, just the same way that you drill with the basketball, or that you are in an outfield and you have to catch hundreds and thousands of balls that are just really hard to catch, to the point where you don't even think about it anymore, right? That feels automatic. I do think that there is something very, very similar in conversations, and the less practice we get at it, the worse we get. It's like anything. But to move in the positive direction, don't forget that when you become really, really practiced at something, it becomes joyful. It becomes fun. And that's what I fear that we've really lost, is that ability to have fun across differences. Never mind that, it's like barely talking to each other. It's like we've forgotten to have fun. That this is the most important thing about being in a college or university campus, is because we get to engage with people who have different points of view than we do. If you're not taking advantage of that, you're missing so much fun, right? And similarly, like, any community, any intentional community, like a retirement community, should be thinking about how much fun it is and how it keeps you alive from the neck up, right? And so if we're not experiencing that joy, we're really missing out on something important that life has to offer.
That's great. All right, take a breath. I'm going to take a look at this first question and try to interpret it here real quick. So let's see. So our first question here has to do with a curious situation in higher education where free speech is entertained and then dutifully ignored as a form of political control. The moral threshold of allowing free speech has been met, but the intended consequences are left wanting. How do you foster free speech in such a way that the speech is engaged with meaningfully?
I think I've understood the nature of the question, but if I fail, let me know, Scott. But what I'm hearing is something like the following: that free speech is a necessary condition for the kind of conversations that we want to have. Open, intellectually open questions where we don't know, we haven't preordained the outcome of the conversation. Freedom of speech is important so that we can engage in the conversation without fear of retribution. So that seems to be a kind of governing principle of what good conversations look like. But while I would say that free speech is a necessary condition to the conversations we want to have on campus, I don't think it's a sufficient condition, because we need those other governing, I would say, virtues or values of the good conversation. So hardline governing principles are things like, you've got academic freedom, and you've got an expectation that you're going to be transparent and accountable in your scholarly work and things like this. I think of those as being underlying rules of the game, sort of the constitution of what good speech looks like. But as we all know, right, the First Amendment does not generate, is not really the norm that's operating at our dinner tables, right? When we raise our kids, First Amendment principles are not, what are in play there. It's the finer and more nuanced virtues and values, cultural norms that are actually governing our behavior in our conversations, whether they're in our personal sphere in civil society or in the academy. And I think that what we need to do a better job at in the academy is being really careful and articulate over and over and over again. Just when we think that we've done it enough, we need to do it again. We need to talk about what those norms are. And so those norms are things like honesty, integrity in our scholarly work, a commitment to humility. And then not just the kind of humility that you have maybe early on in your career that says, I'm not the expert here, or if you're the economist walking into the seminar and in the physics lecture, you've got humility because you just don't know it. You don't know what they're talking about, kind of thing. There's that kind of humility, but there's a deeper epistemological humility at work whenever we're in conversations that says, I've got a point of view. I think it's a well-informed point of view. And also, I don't know what I don't know. right? There's some that I assume that this other person has something to teach me. And I don't know what that is. And that's why I have to maintain that posture of deep humility. So that's the kind of thing that we need to name, and we need to name it over and over again, because I think there's this sort of enculturation process into the life of the mind, whether we're in that life of the mind for 4 years, from freshman to senior year, or it's our career. We've got to have a deep commitment to those values and principles. And that can't just happen inside our own heads. We need to be talking about it with each other. We also need to be giving feedback, not mobbing behavior. We need to be giving feedback when we're failing at that. When someone in our community is failing to have that openness and that humility, we need to be willing to call people out on it. And again, with the hope of true course correction, as opposed to with the hope of embarrassment.
Thank you. So the next question has to do with shoutdowns on campuses. Does a Republic of Science have to leave a seat at the table to bigoted hate speech?
So the way in which the question is put, does the Republic of Science have to offer a seat at the table for bigoted hate speech? Mm-hmm. I'm going to definitively say no.
Okay.
Right? That the Republic of Science is not the public square, right? First Amendment protections protect speech that is colloquially called hate speech, right? And I will stand by those, that principle. There is a difference, though, between the public square and conversations on a college campus. College campuses or university campuses are curated spaces, right? And where I would, going back to the, one way of saying it is that all speech has some form of regulation. Free speech, the First Amendment, is a form of regulation, right? It kind of says this is allowable and this is not allowable. So, and then there's Supreme Court decisions that inform that principle. In a context of a university, we hire specific people with specific credentials to create micro communities. They're called classrooms, and they will offer and they use their judgment and their expertise to decide who enters in on the syllabus, who comes in to give a guest lecture, and my point of view on this is that academic freedom requires that we say to that expert, saying, you get to define the sphere because it's your sphere of authority and autonomy, your classroom. You get to decide who is on the syllabus and who gets a seat at the table, in essence. Okay. Now, what's important, though, is that alongside that faculty member, that professor who's got that sort of microsphere of authority and autonomy, there are hundreds at a big place, it's thousands of other faculty who also have their sphere of autonomy and authority, right? This is a principle called polycentricity. Instead of having one authority determine what gets said or assigned on campus, it's many people get to decide in these little tiny micro spaces about what it gets discussed and put on the syllabus and who gets invited for a guest lecture, et cetera. And because it's because it's many, you've got lots of contestability, you've got lots of competition in these microspheres, right? And that's still openness, and that's openness. Now, if someone comes in with an idea that is unpopular, right? Let's just say it's an unpopular idea. I don't know whether it's a morally obnoxious, whether I would consider it morally obnoxious or not, but we know that it's unpopular, okay? That there are going to be scholars who do not, for that very reason, say, I think this is unpopular because it's morally obnoxious or because it has no grounding in scientific data, right? Someone else says, but it's sociologically really interesting. And I think that there's value by putting it on the syllabus, right? That's exactly as it should be, right? So Holocaust deniers would be a perfect example, right? If you're a historian, typically you would never have a Holocaust denier on your syllabus, right? But if you're a sociologist, who's trying to understand, crank science or, conspiracy theories, you might actually put someone like that on your syllabus because it's of value pedagogically to you. And notice that the same text where one professor would never use, another professor would use, we can't have an authority like the university president or the dean of the business school even to say, you shouldn't have the authority to say what gets put on the syllabus because you don't know enough, right? You don't have that local knowledge about how that particular text is getting used. And we need to have a competition of ideas, not only idea versus idea, but also sort of like micro community, one classroom against another, relative to another micro community. And it's out of that bottom up system of governance that we get the Republic of Science.
That's a really interesting and elegant defense of the Republic against that. What if it comes from a slightly different channel, and put your provost hat on, like your worst provost nightmare here, student groups advance the provocative hate speech person. You might have had this experience. They just, for better or worse, a student group says, we want, crazy person to come speak on campus, and it's going to lead to mess. Right. What does the provost do? But also, where does that fit into the Republic of Science?
So the provost would say, if it is before the fact, if the invitation has not been issued, and the student comes to me, well intended, and says, some people want to invite this person, and I think that they're incendiary. I think they're bad news. But I'm kind of worried about freedom of speech issues, and do I not need to invite this person? And I would ask, well, who has the right to decide? And if they say, I do because I'm the president of the club, or something along those lines, I would say exercise your judgment, right? Exercise your judgment, because there is no inherent right to an invitation. Okay, so somebody like an incendiary speaker can claim, and rightfully so, First Amendment freedoms within the public square, but that does not mean that they are entitled to a campus invitation to speak. But let's say that for whatever reasons the student group has invited this incendiary speaker, another group is up in arms about it. I would say, as provost, if the invitation has been issued by someone or some group that has been sanctioned to issue invitations, we let it go forward, right? And then we're also very careful about making sure that there's appropriate strategizing around things like crowd control to make sure that people are safe, et cetera. But if the invitation has been made, it has to go forward.
Thank you. Let's see what else is here. There's a lot of questions and a lot of energy here. This one's pretty long. Let's see if I can summarize it here. I'm going to come back to it and look at it for a minute, Emily. So can we as a society step back from social media and the negative discourse that is occurring? I was going to head in this direction with you a little bit too, just turning to the economic and political realm and how to make sense out of this pretty, cantankerous moment for America the last many years. And I guess we could bundle those two together. Is there any hope of putting the genie back in the bottle a little bit there and just having more respectable news, more respectable discourse, or is this just the way things are in that realm? Sorry, folks.
Yeah, I don't think it's a sorry, folks. I think it's us still working it out. I don't think that there is a genie, pushing the genie back in the bottle metaphor is a nice one in the sense that we're never going to go back, I don't think, to a time when we've got, essentially 4 major networks on, broadcast networks. We're never going to go back to a point where, the Walter Cronkites of the world are saying that's the way it is, right? It's like there is that breakdown of elite funneling institutions of truth. By the way, there's some really good aspects of that, right? Because that contestability that we're seeing in social media spaces is part of the positive aspect of the story here. Is that 4 news networks is just is not enough competition, right, of ideas. But the problem comes about when there's no governance at all. And I think that's the moment we're in, or it feels like, and when it's think about, we talked about the Republic of Science, that there are all those norms and values that matter. Why do they matter? They matter because scholars have a reputation to protect, right? That's sort of like, if someone were to accuse me of not being accountable for my ideas or not being transparent with my intellectual work, that would be damning, right? And so people care about their reputation, so they want to engage in the Republic of Science and those norms appropriately, right? Well, is that still the case? Do we need to pay closer attention to those norms? Do we need to nurture those norms? And it's in that sense that I think that inside the academy, but beyond it as well, I think we need to think seriously about a kind of civic code. What's the code of conduct that we expect from one another? And let's be clear about when it's being broken. It doesn't mean that it will never be broken, but we seem to have lost the language around holding each other to account in a way. It's almost like it's as if the world, if our evening dinners were ruled by the rules of the public square, they wouldn't be very nice dinners, right? So we have that civic code in our small micro communities and our families. We need to kind of rethink about what a civic code looks like in the context of broader civil society. I think we should expect and demand that that's the case inside the academy, right? That there are professional expectations that we all ought to be adhering to and holding each other to account. I think that's a little more difficult in civil society because it isn't an organization in the same sense that a university is. But I think the same spirit can be held. We need to be talking deliberately about what code of conduct is appropriate, what code of engagement is appropriate. When are we contributing to the benefits of a free society through open discussion? And when are we tearing it down because of something that looks, instead of like that careful, thoughtful critique and feedback, we're engaging in mobbing behavior? Those are 2 totally different things, even though sometimes they get conflated with one another.
Can I keep you for a few more minutes? I've got
Absolutely.
2 questions left. Okay, thank you. And hopefully our audience hangs tight. There's a few good ones. So assuming 2 sides of an argument both utilize classical philosophical methods and logic, they get to 2 completely different truths. What criteria can we use to just make some kind of ultimate judgment on the validity of their argument? We're seeing this right now in contemporary minimum wage debates in economics, Emily. There's an old literature that 95% of economists kind of agree with and say the minimum wage, if set too high, causes unemployment. But then there's a few new studies that have found actually it doesn't have that effect and we ought to do it. How do you sort that out, between, just competing logical arguments in terms of like who's right, or do you just let them keep talking?
Well, the questions on something like that, the question I would ask as someone who sees the world through that lens of, prices work and prices have equilibrating functions, and when you distort the price mechanism, you generally get unintended negative consequences, particularly for the people you're aiming to help. When there's an empirical study that suggests that hasn't played out, first of all, we should read it, right, and internalize what its main takeaways are, and then also, ask the question. We should be sort of thoughtfully interrogating the assumptions that went into the analysis. We should be scratching our heads. You and I, I'm thinking of you and I, Scott, because we're trained economists. We should be scratching our heads as to why our theory did not match up with the data. Right. And that openness and that exchange is, we're going to learn something. Right. And it could be that what we learn is that the data are flawed in some way, or too narrow, or it applies in this circumstance because of X, and there's a specific reason, and and there's something missing in the analysis that needed to be baked into the analysis, and if it had been baked in, you would have gotten the result that we expected. But notice how much work is involved there, right? We have to read it, first of all, we have to interrogate it, but also notice that there's then something that study can teach us. It may mean that we need to qualify our theoretical understanding in a new way. Maybe it challenges us to be more nuanced in our thinking, and it shouldn't just be doctrinaire response that you must be wrong, that analysis must be wrong because it doesn't coincide with my priors. That's a totally different kind of posture. It's instead, it's kind of more like that joy posture that says, "Ooh, that's interesting. How come it didn't turn out the way I expected?" And really dive into it. And if the person on the other side is also engaged in that, they should be scratching their heads too and saying, "Here's why I think it turned out this way." And then maybe if we applied the same analysis to a different industry or different period of time, we could end up with a different result. Well, let's try that out and see what we can learn. The learning should be joyful, should be like an opportunity for openness and fun, and in a weird sort of way, a kind of fun. And I think if we enter in with that spirit, I don't know that we ever solve completely and forever anything, but we learn more and we make progress, and we make our own understanding of our own theoretical priors more nuanced and more informed.
So I'm having joy here in trying to answer a question someone just chimed in and said I missed. It's just because it's long, actually, and I'm trying to unpack it. But who's the judge of whether someone is morally obnoxious? So going back to the crazy uncle discussion, did you ever consider, or does your system have the humility to understand that maybe you're the one confused and morally obnoxious?
Absolutely.
And why do you presume your viewpoint is somehow morally superior? So it's a bundled question there, but
yeah, no, I like the question. I like the question because it's exposing the point that anyone entering into the conversation has to enter in with a sense of humility. And so we could pick topics where the line for me is crossed in a way where I don't need to rethink the whether or not rape is morally good or not. I don't feel like I need to rethink that. And so I'm going to be entering into the conversation with a point of view already pretty well formed. Is it possible that I'm wrong about that? Yes, it is. Right? It is possible. The way in which we are human, however, right? And there. Let me first start by saying there are philosophers who will want to argue the devil's side of that argument because it's intellectually they find some intellectual value in it, and I don't begrudge them that opportunity. That isn't going to be the conversation I enter into because I live in a world in which space and time are limited. Right. I've got a flippant way to say it is I've got better things to do. But I do actually have better things to do. I've got real moral challenges that I know I need to be thinking through. And that isn't one of them. So but is the Republic of Science or philosophical systems open enough that could challenge me, or should it be open enough to challenge me? Absolutely. Right. On anything. Right? Because there might be someone else who's willing to make the argument that shows me the error of my ways. That said, as a human being, we walk in this world with pre-commitments that we've developed. And hopefully we've been really thoughtful about what those pre-commitments are. But if we don't have those pre-commitments, we're questioning everything all the time. we can't make progress in the world, right? I can't make progress on the really hard questions if I'm constantly renegotiating and relitigating something that seems like a settled matter to me, right? The Holocaust denial would be another good example of that. It's like, that doesn't seem to be a place where I want to spend a lot of time thinking about it, because that seems to be a settled matter to me. You've already heard my point of view about, but nonetheless, I still would advocate for a faculty member's right to assign some reading of Holocaust denial on their syllabus for the purposes that they deem to be appropriate. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to be spending my time on it, because I've only got so many years on this planet, and I want to make sure that I'm addressing the most important questions I can address, and that's why I'm going to respect the fact that I walk around with some pre-commitments. That doesn't mean that I wear body armor and can't be challenged, though.
Two more quick questions, I think, and then I'll try to help you wrap up here. So I think I know who this is. Look at Gina Carano. She loses her job for being against not listening and being against cancel culture. This is a Disney person, I think, who was fired, maybe Mandalorian, if I'm remembering correctly. How fearful must people be in higher education about, basically challenging and perhaps being out of their job?
Yeah, self-censorship is a real problem, and self-censorship is a problem not only for faculty; it's a problem for students as well. And so we also need to be thinking about how we cultivate a spirit of openness within ourselves, and an ability to certainly speak civilly, but with courage. And by saying that, I'm not accusing people of lacking courage for being quiet in registering disagreement with accepted wisdom. I think that there is a real concern there, and at the same time, I'm hoping that by having more open discussion around the Republic of Science and the principles that are required of it and the values that drive it, that we can find the courage of our convictions more frequently than we are now, to speak what we believe to be the truth, even if it's in conflict with accepted wisdom, and to do that skillfully, so that we are speaking with a calm confidence, and that we can, even if we don't persuade people who are hard on the other side of the issue, that we are exemplars to those who are kind of like on the fence and trying to think it through, and bring them into the conversation as well. I think the most illiberal elements in our current campus environment, I do actually think that they're perhaps loud in their condemnation of those who don't align with the dominant philosophy, but that's not the majority of folks. And then, so where I'm really, really anxious to engage are the folks who believe in the underlying liberal ethos of a spirit of openness and intellectual freedom of the academy, but are afraid to speak up. Those are the folks I want to engage most, right? Because I think that they're the answer to solving our current problems, is to challenge civilly when those moments are arising, when people are being shut down by people who just don't want to hear a point of view different from the one that they hold.
You made me more optimistic today, Emily, by just asking me, well, how are things going? When I think about the state of affairs at NDSU, it's pretty good on campus in terms of campus culture, and not a lot of the headline news stuff that we're seeing in higher ed journals. Give us on your wrap up here. Give us an optimistic take on our future, both as society and higher ed more specifically. Are you personally optimistic about it, or is what do you see ahead, and what gives you cause for hope?
So I have to adjust both of these things. That on the one hand, it's like the sense of urgency. I've never felt a greater sense of urgency about getting this right, because I do believe that this is not just about saving the industry that I love, which is I love higher education. I love colleges and universities for, all their quirks and, and sometimes, sort of it's crazy making stuff that happens on campuses. I love colleges and universities. And I desperately want to make sure that they're around for as long as possible. But that isn't even the level of sense of urgency. I really do think that if we lose what's special about colleges and universities and that underlying principle of openness and the free exchange and fearless exchange of ideas, if we lose that in the universities, we could lose that in our society. And then I think all bets are off. The liberal democratic principles, that common ground, those common ground principles that we all kind of just assumed would always be there, they might not be there. So that my sense of urgency is at a fever pitch. With that said, though, I do think, in fact, that there is reason for sincere hope. And just look at the current crop of college students who are there, or who are in university right now, right? I've got two of them, and I have never seen a group, a generation that is more open to appreciating and celebrating difference from themselves than ever before. I think that there hasn't been a generation on the planet that has been more open to difference than we've seen here. I think that they are just sort of like by their DNA pluralists, right? And that tolerance of difference, that welcoming of difference, and that it is the pathway towards an open and pluralistic society. I think it is the basics. And again, there are sadly some students who want to shut down those who hold viewpoints different from their own. But I look out at most students. Most students do not want that. Most students want the challenge, the excitement, the exhilaration of late night discussions where they're having that joy of disagreement with their peers in late night conversations in dorm rooms and in classroom conversations. Most students are there, and those are the students we've got to be remembering and thinking about as we're thinking about what good looks like for the state of the university now and going forward.
Emily, thank you so much for joining us. It was wonderful having you and sharing you with NDSU today. Wish you could be here in person. We've got some great things happening, and we'll get you back. Please hang tight. I have no idea if I just hang up on everyone or not, but audience, thank you for joining in, and have a great night.